The reaction was immediate and ferocious, not because anything had been proven, but because the suggestion alone cracked open a door many believed had been sealed forever. Social media lit up within minutes, timelines flooding with clipped quotes, shocked emojis, and headlines carefully padded with words like alleged, claimed, and unverified. Commentators replayed Weinstein's words again and again, dissecting his tone, his timing, his choice to invoke an intelligence agency by name. To some, it sounded like the rambling provocation of a disgraced man desperate to stay relevant. To others, it felt calculated, almost surgical, as if he knew exactly which nerve to strike. The idea that MI6 could possess footage from Cannes, regardless of what that footage might show, was enough to send imaginations spiraling. People weren't reacting to evidence, they were reacting to possibility. And possibility, when it involves Hollywood, royalty, and secrecy, is combustible. What made the moment even more unsettling was the silence that followed. No immediate rebuttal, no fiery denial, just a vacuum that allowed speculation to swell. Media panels filled the gap, reminding viewers that intelligence agencies routinely monitor high-profile international events, that Cannes is as much about power as it is about cinema, and that being observed does not automatically imply wrongdoing. Still, the narrative had already taken on a life of its own. Old photos resurfaced, red carpet appearances were reanalyzed, and past interviews were replayed with new suspicion layered over old words. A familiar cycle kicked in, context stripped away, moments frozen, meaning reassigned. This was no longer about what happened or didn't happen years ago. It was about perception, about how quickly a carefully constructed public image can be destabilized by a single provocative sentence. The story hooked people because it sat at the intersection of so many fascinations: the fall of a powerful man, the mystery of intelligence agencies, and the relentless curiosity surrounding a woman whose life has been scrutinized at every stage. Whether Weinstein was bluffing, exaggerating, or simply lashing out in that first wave, the damage, at least to the conversation, was already done. Section 1 of this saga wasn't defined by footage or proof, but by shock, silence, and the unsettling realization that in the modern media landscape, suggestion alone can feel as heavy as truth. As the initial shock settled, the conversation shifted from outrage to analysis, and that's where the story began to evolve into something more complex. Commentators stopped asking whether the claim was scandalous and started asking why it had been made at all. Timing became the obsession. Weinstein's retrial, the renewed public attention on his legacy, and the ongoing fascination with Meghan's post-royal life created a perfect storm. In that context, his words felt less like a confession and more like a calculated provocation designed to muddy waters and reframe narratives. By invoking MI6, he wasn't just talking about personal history, he was dragging institutions, secrecy, and national intrigue into the mix, elevating his claim from tabloid gossip to something that sounded almost geopolitical. Media analysts pointed out a familiar pattern. When powerful figures fall, they often attempt to redistribute blame, to suggest that success around them was never accidental or innocent. In this version of events, ambition replaces victimhood, and complexity replaces clear moral lines. The discussion became less about any single interaction and more about how Hollywood has historically functioned, especially in spaces like Cannes where access and influence blur together. Panels debated whether networking itself had been unfairly recast as something sinister, or whether the industry's long-standing tolerance for blurred boundaries made such reinterpretations inevitable. The footage, still unseen by the public, became a kind of Rorschach test. People projected onto it whatever confirmed their existing beliefs. Behind the scenes, sources speculated about damage control. Silence, they argued, can be a strategy, especially when responding risks amplifying an unverified claim. Others insisted that silence creates its own narrative, one where absence of denial becomes fuel for suspicion. Every hour without comment added another layer of tension. Meanwhile, online communities split into camps, some fiercely defending Meghan as a target of a disgraced man's vendetta, others insisting that unanswered questions deserved attention. The story fed on polarization, growing louder precisely because no definitive information emerged to shut it down. What became clear during this phase was that the alleged footage itself almost didn't matter. Its power lay in its potential existence, in the idea that somewhere in a classified archive or leaked file, there might be images capable of reshaping how a familiar story is told. That uncertainty kept audiences hooked. Section 2 of this unfolding drama wasn't driven by revelation, but by interpretation, as motives were questioned, strategies inferred, and the line between accountability and speculation grew increasingly thin. Section Continue 3. As attention intensified, the focus widened beyond the individuals involved and landed squarely on the systems that allow stories like this to gain traction in the first place. Commentators began dissecting the culture of prestige events, not just Cannes, but the entire ecosystem of global showcases where ambition, image, and access intertwine. These are environments where nothing is written down, yet everything is understood, where proximity itself becomes a form of currency. In that context, the idea of intelligence agencies observing from the margins didn't seem as far-fetched to some analysts as it might have a decade ago. Whether or not any footage exists, the notion tapped into a broader unease about surveillance, power, and how closely public and private lives can intercept when influence is at stake. The conversation also turned toward narrative control. Who gets to define a person's past, especially when their present status amplifies every rumor? Supporters argued that revisiting years-old interactions through a modern lens risks erasing nuance and agency, reducing complex professional environments into simplistic morality plays. Critics countered that history has shown how often such environments protected those with power, leaving uncomfortable truths obscured until someone forced them into daylight. The tension between those views kept the debate alive, with each side claiming to defend fairness while accusing the other of blindness. Social media accelerated everything. Short clips, decontextualized quotes, and speculative threads traveled faster than any official clarification could. Influencers framed the story as a puzzle, inviting audiences to connect dots that might not belong together. Each repost added another layer of interpretation, another implied conclusion. In this space, certainty mattered less than engagement. The alleged footage became a symbol representing whatever each viewer believed about fame, ambition, and the cost of upward mobility. Quietly, industry veterans reminded audiences of a simple truth. Proximity to power does not automatically equate to complicity, just as ambition does not negate vulnerability. Careers are often shaped by a series of calculated decisions made within imperfect systems. That reality rarely fits neatly into viral narratives, but it lingers beneath them. By the time Section 3 of the story unfolded, it was clear that the real impact wasn't about proving or disproving a claim. It was about how quickly uncertainty can be weaponized, how reputations can be reshaped by suggestion alone, and how once a story enters the public imagination, it develops a momentum of its own that is nearly impossible to stop. By the time the discussion reached this stage, the story had taken on a life far larger than its original claim. What began as a provocative quote had evolved into a referendum on trust, institutions, and the fragile boundary between public curiosity and private history. Observers noted how easily intelligence agencies were cast as omniscient puppet masters, capable of pulling secrets from the past at will. That image alone was powerful enough to unsettle audiences, especially in an era already saturated with fears about data, surveillance, and unseen influence. Whether accurate or exaggerated, the idea resonated because it mirrored a broader anxiety about how little control individuals truly have once they step into the global spotlight. Within royal watching circles, the implications were dissected with surgical precision. Analysts debated how modern monarchy survives, not just on tradition, but on narrative stability. Any suggestion that hidden material could surface at any moment threatened that stability, not because of what it proved, but because of what it implied, that even the most carefully managed public figures remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Silence, in this context, became its own message. Every day without a direct response fueled speculation, yet any response risked amplifying the story further. It was a classic dilemma, one faced repeatedly by institutions accustomed to managing perception rather than confronting ambiguity head-on. Meanwhile, the entertainment industry watched nervously. The resurfacing of old associations, real or rumored, reminded many how quickly past connections can be reinterpreted when power dynamics shift. Producers, agents, and actors alike recognized the pattern. Today's networking anecdote can become tomorrow's scandal headline if circumstances change. This recognition didn't necessarily validate the claims, but it explained why so many people reacted with discomfort rather than outright disbelief. The system had seen similar reckonings before, and each one left scars. As the narrative expanded, some voices attempted to slow it down, urging a return to verifiable facts and cautioning against treating implication as evidence. They argued that stories built primarily on suggestion often say more about collective fears than individual actions. Yet restraint struggled to compete with the momentum of intrigue. The idea that unseen footage could exist somewhere, locked away and waiting, was simply too compelling. It transformed the story from a debate about past behavior into a meditation on power itself, who holds it, who loses it, and how easily it can be used to reshape reputations long after the moment has passed. As the cycle of speculation reached its peak, a quieter realization began to surface beneath the noise. Stories like this rarely deliver clean resolutions. They don't end with definitive proof neatly laid out for public judgment. Instead, they linger in the collective imagination, reshaping how figures are perceived long after headlines fade. What mattered now was not whether every claim would be substantiated, but how the existence of the narrative itself altered the emotional landscape around everyone involved. Once doubt enters the room, it never fully leaves. For many viewers, the episode became less about individuals and more about systems. Hollywood, intelligence agencies, and royalty all appeared as overlapping worlds where ambition, access, and secrecy coexist. Each institution brought its own mythology, and the collision of those myths created a story that felt bigger than any single person. It tapped into a shared suspicion that success at the highest levels is rarely accidental, and that unseen hands often guide visible outcomes. Whether that belief is fair or flawed, it is deeply ingrained, and stories like this reinforce it. In the end, the lasting impact may be psychological rather than factual. Reputations don't just rely on truth, they rely on confidence, and confidence erodes when narratives spiral beyond control. Even if nothing further emerges, the memory of the allegation remains archived in public consciousness, ready to resurface whenever circumstances align. That is the quiet power of suggestion, especially in an age where information never truly disappears. As attention gradually shifts to the next breaking controversy, this story will settle into a familiar place, not fully believed, not fully dismissed. It becomes part of the background hum that follows public figures everywhere, a reminder that past chapters are never completely closed. And, in that sense, the episode serves as a broader cautionary tale. In a world driven by exposure and speculation, the line between history and rumor grows thinner each day, and once crossed, it is almost impossible to redraw.